The gloves were the only thing she asked for. Not a larger room in Harrow Hall, not a seat closer to the fire during supper, not even the small courtesy of being addressed by her given name rather than the midwife's daughter. Just the gloves, a pair of pale kid leather that reached past her wrists, which Ivy Croft wore every single day, from the morning she arrived at Harrow Hall to the evening Lord Julian Harrow's mother decided she had endured enough of mysteries. Ivy had come to Harrow Hall in October, when the larch trees along the North Drive had gone the colour of old coins, and the ground had begun its slow hardening toward winter. She had come not as a guest, not as a servant, but as something the household had no proper category for. The new Lady Harrow, wife of 3 weeks to a baron, who had by all accounts lost his mind some said between his first wife's funeral and the signing of the marriage register. That was what the household whispered anyway. Ivy heard them. She had always been good at hearing things people assumed she could not. She had grown up in the back rooms of her mother's practice, a midwife of considerable reputation in the county of Northumberland, and she had learned early that the walls of a sick room are thin and the people waiting outside them speak freely. She had learned to take inventory of a room the moment she entered it, who stood close to the door, who kept their hands folded too tightly, who smiled with their mouth but not their eyes. These were not lessons anyone had sat her down to teach. They were simply what you absorbed when your childhood was spent among women in the most unguarded moments of their lives. Lord Gabriel Harrow, she had not yet learned to think of him as Gabriel, not then, had met her mother 3 years prior, when his first wife, Caroline, had laboured for 2 days and delivered a son who did not survive the hour. Her mother had stayed at Harrow Hall for a week afterward, tending to Lady Harrow through the fever that followed. Ivy had come once to bring her mother a change of clothes and the particular tincture she prepared herself from meadowsweet and willow bark, and she had passed Lord Harrow in the corridor outside his wife's room. He had looked through her entirely. She did not blame him. He had the face of a man who had forgotten there was a world beyond that closed door. Caroline Harrow died 14 months later. Not from the fever. She had recovered from that well enough. She died quietly in her sleep, of what the physician called a weakness of the heart. Ivy's mother had shaken her head when she heard, and said nothing further, which Ivy understood to mean she believed the physician had missed something. Her mother often shook her head at physicians. The proposal, if one could call it that, had come through her mother, as such things sometimes did in circumstances where the usual channels had been quietly bypassed. Lord Harrow required a wife of practical disposition and calm temperament. He had a son from his first marriage, a boy of 4 named Theo, who had survived infancy against considerable odds and now required a stable household. Lord Harrow himself was consumed by the management of 3 estates and a prolonged dispute with the Crown over mineral rights on the Northumberland property. He had no time. He had communicated through his solicitor for a courtship. He had time only for a decision. Ivy's mother had not pressed her. She had laid out the facts the way she laid out instruments before a procedure, cleanly, without opinion, and then she had left the room and let Ivy think. What Ivy thought about, alone in the small parlour of their house in Alnwick, was not the title or the security or even the child, though the child had moved her more than she expected when she let herself consider him. What she thought about was the gloves. She had worn them for 4 years. She wore them in summer, claiming sensitivity to sun. She wore them at supper, removing them only to eat and replacing them immediately after. She had become so practiced at this small concealment that it had ceased to feel like concealment at all. It had become simply who she was, the way some women were known for always carrying a particular olche, or favouring a particular chair. No one had asked her directly. People in Alnwick were on the whole too polite to ask directly, and those who were not polite enough had learned that Ivy Croft had a way of looking at a person that made the question die before it left their lips. She wrote back through the solicitor. She had one condition. She would require the freedom to manage her own dress and personal effects, without interference from household staff. She phrased it as a preference for privacy in her toilette, which was both true and sufficient. The solicitor wrote back within the week. Lord Harrow agreed. She did not meet him again until the morning of the marriage, in the vestry of the church in Morpeth. He was taller than she remembered, and considerably thinner, with the particular leanness of a man who has been forgetting to eat. He had grey beginning at his temples that had not been there 3 years ago. He looked at her with eyes that were direct and measuring and not unkind, and he said, "Miss Croft, thank you for making the journey," as if she had come for a consultation, as if they were about to discuss a patient rather than a vow. She found, to her own surprise, that she did not mind this. She had never been a woman who required sentiment before function. "Lord Harrow," she said, and they went in to be married. Harrow Hall was a house that had been added to by successive generations without any of them consulting the others, with the result that it sprawled in 3 directions from its original Jacobean core and possessed corridors that ended in unexpected walls and staircases that led to rooms of uncertain purpose. Ivy found this charming in a way she had not anticipated. She had always liked buildings that told the truth about their own history. What she did not find charming was Lady Dorothea Harrow. Lord Harrow's mother was 63 years old and had been widowed for 11 of those years, during which time she had occupied the east wing of Harrow Hall with the settled authority of a woman who has decided that a change of address would represent an unacceptable concession to mortality. She was handsome in the way of women who have always known they were handsome, and she moved through the house with the particular assurance of someone who has never, not once, doubted her right to be precisely where she is. She had received Ivy in the drawing-room on the afternoon of their arrival, seated by the fire with a piece of needlework she was not working on, and she had looked at Ivy with an expression of careful neutrality that Ivy recognized from her midwifery years as the face a woman makes when she has already decided something, and is merely waiting for the situation to confirm it. "My son tells me you are the daughter of the Croft woman," Lady Harrow said. "The midwife, yes," Ivy said. "She is very well regarded in the county." "I'm sure she is," Lady Harrow said, in a tone that implied this was not the point. Theo was brought in after tea, a small boy with his father's direct gaze and a recent haircut that had gone slightly wrong on one side. He assessed Ivy with the frank seriousness of a child who has learned to take new people seriously, and then he said, "Do you know how to play spillikins?" "I do," Ivy said. "Caroline couldn't," he said. Caroline had been what he called his mother, which Ivy found both sad and sensible. She said the sticks were too small. "They are quite small," Ivy agreed. "You have to be very patient." He seemed to find this answer satisfactory. He allowed her to sit beside him on the floor after supper, while he demonstrated his technique, which was confident and almost entirely ineffective, and Ivy let him win twice before winning once herself, to establish that she was not merely humouring him. He went to bed without protest that night, which the nursemaid later told her was unprecedented. Lord Harrow observed all of this from the doorway. When Theo had gone upstairs, he came and sat in the chair across from Ivy, and was quiet for a moment in the particular way of a man who is composing something. "He has not taken to people easily," he said finally. "Since Caroline, he will take to people he trusts," Ivy said. "He is testing whether I mean what I say." Lord Harrow looked at her steadily. "Do you?" "When I say a thing," Ivy said, "I mean it." He nodded once, slowly, as if filing this information in a place he intended to keep it. Then he wished her good night and went to his study, and Ivy sat alone by the fire and thought that this was, on balance, a reasonable beginning. The trouble, as it had always been, was the gloves. In Alnwick she had managed, but Harrow Hall had a full household staff, and household staff, particularly in a house where the mistress was new and uncertain, watched. She felt their eyes on her hands at breakfast, at supper, in the mornings when she walked through the kitchen garden with Theo. They were not unkind eyes, mostly. They were curious, the way people are curious about anything that doesn't quite fit the expected shape of things. She had brought 6 pairs of gloves with her. She wore them at table, removing them to eat as she always did. And she was quick about the removal and quicker about replacing them, and she was careful, as she had always been careful, to keep her left hand slightly angled away from the light. The housekeeper, Miss Pennick, was too experienced to comment and too intelligent not to notice. Ivy caught her looking twice, and each time Mrs. Pennick had simply continued with whatever she had been doing, her expression professionally blank. Ivy respected this. She also knew it meant the woman had noticed more than she was saying. What she had not accounted for was Lady Dorothea Harrow's patience. She had taken Lady Harrow for a woman of immediate reaction, the sort who would press and probe within the first fortnight, and then, finding Ivy impervious, redirect her energies elsewhere. She had been wrong. Lord Harrow's mother was, in fact, a woman of considerable strategic patience, and she had spent the first 3 weeks of Ivy's tenure observing and cataloguing and waiting for the right moment. The right moment, as it turned out, was the dinner in honour of the Honourable Clement Voss and his wife, the annual occasion on which the county's most senior families descended upon Harrow Hall for a meal that lasted 4 courses and an eternity. There were 14 at table. The dining room was long and candlelit and lined along the south wall with the Harrow family's collection of Flemish mirrors, which doubled the light and reflected every face back on itself in the amber warmth of 100 candles. Ivy had dressed carefully. She wore the grey silk that Mrs. Pennick had pressed that morning, which had a neckline modest enough and long enough sleeves that her wrists were nearly covered, and she had chosen her best gloves, ivory kid, barely worn, and she had told herself, as she had told herself every year for 4 years, that an evening was only a few hours, and she had managed evenings before. She sat 3 chairs down from Lord Harrow, which was correct and expected, and she spoke to the gentleman on her right about the mineral dispute, about which she knew rather more than he expected, and she spoke to Mrs. Voss on her left about the early frost and its effect on the kitchen garden, and she ate carefully and replaced her gloves between courses without drawing attention, and she thought, "This is going well enough." She did not see Lady Harrow move. She was attending to something Miss Voss had said, something about the railway which she did not care about and was pretending to. And there was a pressure at her left wrist, sudden and deliberate, and then the cool slide of the glove coming free, and Ivy's hand was bare on the white tablecloth, in the full warmth of the candles and the mirrors, and the dining room went very, very quiet. She did not move. She had learned, in her mother's work, that the first seconds of a shock were the seconds that mattered, and that what she did with her face in those first seconds would determine everything that came after. She kept her expression still. She kept her breathing even. She felt the eyes of 12 people, no, of the mirrors, doubling them, 24, find her hand and hold. Her left wrist, and the back of her left hand, and the inside of her palm, burned. Not the rough, ridged burns of an accident, the careful, deliberate kind. A pattern that anyone who looked closely enough would understand was not an accident at all. She had been 8 years old. She did not think about being 8 years old. She had not thought about it, consciously and deliberately. In years, Lady Harrow said from behind her, "I simply wondered why you never remove your gloves at the table." The voice was pleasant, conversational. As if she had asked about the weather, Ivy turned her head and looked at her mother-in-law. She looked at her for a long time. She said nothing. It was Lord Harrow who spoke. He had risen from his chair. She had not heard him rise. She had not heard anything in those first several seconds except a high, clean tone behind her own ears. But he was on his feet, and he was looking at his mother with an expression Ivy had not seen on his face before. It was not anger, exactly. It was something older and colder than anger, the expression of a man who has arrived at a conclusion he cannot unknow. "You will," he said to his mother very quietly, "leave this table." The room was so still that Ivy could hear the candles. "Gabriel," Lady Harrow began. "Now," Lord Harrow said, "you will go to your rooms. We will speak in the morning." There was a pause of perhaps 4 seconds that felt considerably longer, then the sound of Lady Harrow's chair moving back, then her footsteps, measured and unhurried, because she would not be seen to hurry, then the door. 14 people, no, 12 now, 12, sat in the silence she left behind. Lord Harrow sat back down. He looked at Ivy. She looked at him. He picked up his wine-glass. He said to the table at large, with the perfectly calibrated tone of a man who has been managing English social situations since boyhood, "I believe Mrs. Voss was asking about the new conservatory." And the dinner continued. He came to her sitting room at 10:30. She was at the window with her book, or rather, she was sitting at the window with her book open in her hands, not reading it. When there was a knock, 2 precise knocks, and she said, "Come in," and he did. He stood just inside the door. He had taken off his dinner coat and was in his shirt sleeves, which she thought was the least composed she had ever seen him. And his expression was, she searched for the word, and the word she found was careful. As if he were carrying something he did not want to spill. "I wanted to ensure you were all right," he said. "I am," she said. This was, and was not, true. She was not shaking. She had stopped shaking an hour ago. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You don't have to tell me anything." She looked at him. She thought about this. She had never told anyone, not because she had been instructed not to. Her father had died when she was 12, and there was no one left to instruct her in anything, but because the telling of it had always felt like the wrong shape, like a thing that would not fit through the door of ordinary conversation without breaking the frame. "My father," she said, "was a precise man." She paused. "He believed in precision, in consequences, proportionate to errors." Another pause. "I was not a precise child." She stopped. She looked at her hand, the left one, bare now, resting in her lap. "He used a kitchen implement," she said. "He was consistent about it. He believed that consistency was important in the raising of children." The silence in the room was different from the silence in the dining room. This one had weight in it, not the held breath kind, but the kind that presses gently in from all sides, the kind that means, something is being carried here, and I am going to help carry it. Lord Harrow crossed the room. He sat down in the chair across from her, not close, an appropriate distance, but not the distance of a stranger. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees. "How old were you?" he said. "When it stopped?" 11, she said. "He had a riding accident. His hands—" She paused. He could not manage the grip after. There was something almost. She noticed it before she could stop herself. Something almost ironic about this. And she saw the moment Gabriel Harrow noticed it too, and saw the moment he decided not to comment on it. And she found that she was grateful to him for that decision. "I became useful to my mother after that," she said. "I was always the one who could be still in a room when things were difficult." She thought it was a gift. She looked out the window. I think she was right. It just came from somewhere she didn't know about. He was quiet for a while. "My mother," he said finally, "has never understood that some things are not hers to know." He said it without heat. It was a plain statement of fact, the way he said most things. "I should have seen this coming. She has been watching your hands for weeks." "I know," Ivy said. He looked at her. "You know, yes. And you—" He stopped. He began again. "You calculated the risk. I thought she would ask me directly before she acted," Ivy said. "I misjudged her. She is more theatrical than I gave her credit for." Something shifted in his expression. It was not quite a smile. It was more the shadow of one, passing quickly. "She was on the stage," he said, "before she married my father. She doesn't speak of it." Ivy stared at him. He said with absolute seriousness. She was apparently quite gifted, and Ivy, for the first time since the glove had left her hand, laughed. It surprised her, the sound of it, the way it came up without warning, and she pressed her fingers to her mouth. And she felt, in the particular way of people who have been holding a great deal of weight for a very long time, the slight give of something that had been rigid. Gabriel Harrow watched her laugh, and his expression had gone to something she did not have a word for yet. Not then, not on that night in the sitting room with the fire going low and the book face down in her lap. She would find the word for it later. Lady Dorothea Harrow left Harrow Hall on a Thursday, 2 weeks after the dinner. It was not banishment. Gabriel was careful to make this clear to his mother, and then careful to make it equally clear that her clarity on this point was the only concession he was prepared to make. There was a property in Bath that had been her preference before she married, and which had since become her own through the terms of the late Lord Harrow's will. It had a good house and a good society, and was, as Gabriel observed in their conversation, more suited to her particular interests than a working Northumberland estate. Lady Harrow received this information with the composed expression of a woman who is calculating futures. Then she said, "I suppose you think I owe her an apology." "I think," Gabriel said, "that an apology would be a beginning. What you do after the beginning is your own affair." She did come on the Wednesday before she departed. Ivy was in the still room. She had taken over the still room within the first week, which Mrs. Pennick had permitted with the particular relief of a woman who had never liked managing it herself. And she heard Lady Harrow's footstep in the doorway, and looked up from the pot of rosehip syrup she was reducing. Lady Harrow looked at the still room, the ordered jars, the hanging bundles, the small brass scale, and then she looked at Ivy with an expression that was not quite what Ivy had expected. It was not remorse, not exactly. It was something more complicated. The expression of a woman who has done a thing for reasons she believed were right and has arrived, not at the conclusion that she was wrong to have reasons, but at the conclusion that the reasons were less right than she thought. "I wanted to know what you were hiding," Lady Harrow said. "I thought, if it was something shameful, something that would harm my son's position." "I know what you thought," Ivy said. She kept her voice level. "You were not wrong to wonder. You were wrong in what you did with the wandering." A silence. "Yes," Lady Harrow said at last. "I was." It was not a fulsome apology. It was not the apology of a woman who has fully understood the harm she caused, and Ivy did not pretend that it was. But it was the truth, and Lady Dorothea Harrow, for all her faults, had not lied to her once since the moment they met. Ivy found she could work with that. "Thank you for saying so," Ivy said, and turned back to her pot. Lady Harrow left the next day. Theo stood at the front door and waved, solemnly, until the carriage was out of sight. Then he turned to Ivy and said, "Will she come back at Christmas?" "I don't know," Ivy said. "Perhaps. She's not very nice to you," he said, with the direct accuracy of a 5-year-old. "No," Ivy agreed. "She isn't, but she loves your father very much in her way." He considered this. "Papa says loving someone in your way isn't the same as loving them properly." Ivy looked down at him. "When did he say that? Last night?" Theo took her gloved hand. She was wearing the ivory ones again, and began to walk back toward the house. "He said he was going to try to do it properly from now on. I think he meant about you." Ivy walked with him through the door and into the entrance hall where the cold came through the stones and the lamplight was warm, and somewhere in the back of the house she could hear Mrs. Pennick giving instructions about the larder. She did not say anything. She kept her face still, the way she had learned. But under the ivory kid leather the skin of her left hand, burned and scarred and 4 years hidden, felt, for the first time in a very long time, warm. Winter came early to Northumberland that year, the way it always did, without apology or announcement, simply arriving one morning as a white fact on the ground. Ivy had learned the rhythms of the house by then. Which doors stuck in the cold, which chimneys drew poorly, which of the kitchen maids cried when she was overtired and needed to be sent to bed early with a hot brick. She had learned that Theo could be coaxed through his lessons with the promise of exactly 1/2 hour of spillikins afterward, no more, and that if you exceeded this by even 5 minutes, he would become belligerent about adverbs for the rest of the afternoon. She had learned that Gabriel took his coffee black and his correspondence standing up, and that he had a habit, when he was troubled, of going to stand by the window in the library and looking out at the north drive as if the answer to whatever was troubling him might come walking up it at any moment. She had begun to learn Gabriel. It happened slowly, the way the useful things happened. Not in a single revelation, but in the accumulation of small observations, the way she had learned the uses of every herb in her mother's still room one at a time, over years. She learned that he laughed rarely and meant it every time. She learned that he was harder on himself than on anyone else, and that this was both a virtue and a considerable inconvenience. She learned that he had loved his first wife deeply and grieved her still, and that this did not, she found, trouble her. It told her he was capable of depth, and depth she could work with. She was in the still room on the Tuesday before Christmas when he found her there for the second time. She had the rosehip syrup going again. Theo had a cold, a mild one, the kind children got in November and then forgot about by December. And she was measuring out dried elderflower with the small brass scale when Gabriel ducked through the low door and stood looking at the room with something that was becoming. She recognized a familiar expression. He came to look at her work sometimes. He never commented on it directly. He picked things up and set them down and read the labels on the jars with the concentrated attention of a man who is learning a foreign language, one word at a time. "Mrs. Pennick says you redesigned the whole storage system," he said. "The previous one was organized by color," Ivy said, "which is aesthetically pleasing but not particularly useful in the dark." He came to stand beside her at the work table. He looked at the scale. He looked at her hands. She had stopped, she realized, being careful about her hands around him. Not the gloves. She still wore the gloves in company, and she thought she probably would for a long time yet, and she thought that was all right. But in the mornings, in the still room, in the evenings by the fire, when it was only the two of them, she had stopped the angling away from the light. He picked up her left hand. He did it simply, as if it were a thing he had thought about doing for some time, and had finally decided to do. He turned it over. He looked at the burns on the back of her hand, the pattern on her palm, the small, precise lines at her wrist. He did not say anything. He did not arrange his face into pity or disgust, or the particular careful blankness of people trying to hide both. He looked at them the way she had seen her mother look at injuries, with attention, with respect for what they were telling her, with the quiet acknowledgement that something had happened here that mattered. Then he set her hand down. He did not let go of it. "Theo," he said, after a moment, "has told me he intends to teach you to fish in the spring." "He mentioned it," Ivy said. "He is not very good at it," Gabriel said. "I feel you should know this going in." "I suspected," Ivy said. "His patience runs out at approximately the same speed with fish as with adverbs." Gabriel made the sound, barely a sound, more a controlled movement of breath, that she had come to understand was, for him, a laugh. They stood at the work table with the elderflower and the brass scale, and the low winter light coming through the still-room window, and his hand held hers, the scarred one, and the house around them was full of the small sounds of an ordinary afternoon. Ivy thought, "This is not what I expected." She thought, "I think it may be better." Outside, the snow had begun again, light, the first tentative kind, the kind that lands on the ground and considers its options before committing. Theo's voice came from somewhere upstairs, calling for someone named Percy, who was either a friend, a toy, or, Ivy now suspected, the hall cat under an assumed identity. She did not move her hand. Gabriel did not let go. The snow came down on the north drive, and the larch trees, and the long, irregular roofline of Harrow Hall, and inside, in the still room, that smelled of rosehip and elderflower, and the good clean cold of a house that was learning to be a home again, two people who had arrived at each other by the least likely of routes stood together and said nothing, because nothing was, for once, exactly enough.